Today, we're talking about sewing vocabulary. Our first word is the hand needle. This is a small, sharp metal piece. One end has the point. That is where you put it through the fabric. The other end has what's called the eye of the needle. This is a small opening, and that's where you put the thread through to pull it through while you're sewing. Next, we have fabric scissors, or sometimes they're also called shears. So these are very, very sharp. They're only meant to be used on fabric. You never want to use your fabric scissors or your shears to cut paper or anything else or tape. This will dull the blade and will make it to where it will not cut fabric anymore. So it's very important when you're cutting fabric that you have sharp scissors. That'll make it much easier to cut your fabric in a nice straight line, and it'll cut through the fibers of the fabric easier. So never use your fabric scissors or shears for cutting paper or anything else. Then you have a seam ripper. So this is a small tool. One end of it has a little red dot at the end, and underneath that little U section right here, there's a little blade in it. So that blade will help you take your stitches out. So when you're sewing, if you make a mistake with the fabric, it's hard. You can't just pull the thread out. So you will use the seam ripper, and this is how you break the thread, and then you can remove the thread from the fabric. So you use that blade right here to cut the thread, and then you can pull the stitch out of your fabric. So this will become a very handy tool that you will use often, because when you're sewing, you will make mistakes, and so this is how you'll remove those mistakes from your fabric with your seam ripper. Next, we have a pin cushion. So this kind of looks like a tomato. Um, you put your pins and your needles into this pin cushion when they're not in use. That way that the sharp point is somewhere safe so you can't get poked. Um, and then it gives them a good place that you can easily grab them from to put them into your fabric. The little chili pepper looking thing at the end is to use to help clean your needles and kind of sharpen them a little bit. So if your pins and your needles are starting to get dull, or if you got something sticky on it, from using tape or something, you can use that to help clean those pins and needles. Then we have a tape measure. So this is kind of like a ruler, except for a ruler is sturdy and does not bend. A tape measure is flexible. So you would use this to take your measurements to measure any seams. If you need to create sleeves for a shirt, you would measure how long the arm is. So this is where you would take measurements. It's flexible so that way you can go around your arms, your legs, your stomach to get your measurements when you're sewing and creating garments. Next, you have your pins. So these are similar to a needle. One end has a sharp point, but the other end either has a colorful little knob at the end, or sometimes it has a flat piece to almost make it look like a nail. So you use these pins to hold your fabric together when you're sewing or when you're cutting out your fabric. So if you have two pieces of fabric that you need to keep together so that way you can sew those pieces of fabric, you'd put your pins in it. And this holds the fabric together so when you're sewing, it doesn't slide or slip, or when you're cutting, you can cut it evenly, both pieces of fabric evenly. So pins will keep stuff attached to each other. Then you have a sewing gauge. So this is also kind of like a ruler. If you notice, it has this little slide on here. So this actually moves. So if you look at your shirt, you have a seam, and you have where your shirt's folded over a little bit. So the sewing gauge is used to measure how big your seam will be. So you would move this slider. If you wanted to be half an inch, you'd move it here, or an inch, and then you use it to check and measure to make sure your seam is the same size all the way around, or wherever you're sewing it. That way it's not all crooked. Then you have a needle threader. So sometimes the eye of the needle is very small and it's hard to put the thread through the eye of the needle. So this needle threader helps with that. You feed the needle threader through the eye of the needle, and then you put the thread through this loop. And then when you pull on the needle thread, it'll pull the thread through the eye of the needle. So if you're struggling with threading your needle, this needle threader will become your best friend. Next, we have marking chalk or pencils. So these look like colored pencils, except for instead of lead in the point, you have chalk. So when you have a pattern and you're trying to cut your fabric out with that pattern, you lay your pattern down on top of the fabric, and then you can trace it with the marking chalk. So instead of using a Sharpie or a marker that won't wash out, this marking chalk is easily washable. And so you would mark your fabric with the marking chalk, and then you wash it and it goes away. Then we have a tracing wheel. So this kind of looks like a pizza cutter with teeth around the edges. It's not sharp, but this is also used when tracing a pattern onto fabric. There's tracing paper, that one side of it is kind of chalky, and you would just trace it with that tracing wheel, and it'll put kind of a dotted pattern where you need to cut. Then we have thread. So these are 3 different spools of thread. They do come in different shapes and sizes, and thread comes in different material. It can be made of cotton, fiber, polyester. But so the thread is what holds your fabric together. So you put it through the needle, and then you make your stitches, and that's what holds the fabric together or the seams together is a thread. Next, we have a bobbin. So a bobbin goes into the sewing machine. They come in plastic. This is an example of a plastic one, or they come metal. But this bobbin, you end up winding thread around the bobbin, and then you place the bobbin in the sewing machine, and it helps you when you're sewing. This is only used for a sewing machine, though, not hand sewing. Next, we have a pattern. So a pattern is a template. So here's a template for making a shirt. We have the front and the back of the shirt. This would be the collar. And then the sleeves are here. So you use a pattern to make a template. If you notice the shirt you're wearing, it's not one piece. Some of them have a front piece, a back piece, and then the sleeves. It just depends on what type of shirt you have, or your pants are made up of different layers that are sewn together. So it's different pieces that are put together to make your garment. And so a pattern helps guide you to make that. Next, we have a thimble. So this can be metal or plastic, but sometimes when you're sewing things like jeans that are a thicker material, it can be hard to get the needle through. So, and it can hurt the tip of your finger when you're pushing the needle. So the thimble you would put on your finger, and it helps protect you from getting stuck by the needle. Next, we have the face. So some fabrics, one side is different colors from the other side. It depends on the type of fabric it is. So some fabrics, the right side is where the pattern is bright and vibrant and very colorful. And then if you flip it over, the wrong side has the colors that are dulled a lot. So when you're sewing, you want to make sure that your right sides are facing out when you finish your garment, and you don't want them facing in, because then it'll be the dull colors instead of the bright, vibrant colors. Next, we have raw edge. So the raw edge, when you cut your fabric, the raw edge is that edge where you cut. So the fabric will start to fray a little bit, and that's where your raw edge is. So that's why you sew it. You either sew a hem, so you fold it over and sew it, or you sew it connected with another piece of fabric, because fabric will continue to fray right here. And so that edge where it frays is called the raw edge. Then you have a back stitch. So this is the process. We'll use this when we're sewing on sewing machines. This is a process where you sew backwards over the loose threads. So you start your stitch, and then you go back over it backwards, and then you go forwards again. And this helps lock in your thread, so that way it doesn't come out. Next, we have our seam. So this is the line where 2 pieces of fabric are sewn together. So if you look at your shirt, on the side of your shirt, you have your front and your back side of the shirt that were sewn together, and there's a seam there. So the seam is just where 2 fabrics are sewn together. Next, we have our seam allowance. So this is what I was talking about with your sewing gauge. So our seam allowance is how far the stitch is from the edge of the fabric. So if you look, you see the edge of the fabric, and then you see your stitch is over a little bit. So the seam allowance is how far back you sew your stitch from that from the seam or the fold. Next, we have our hem. So this is the edge of the fabric that's been folded or sewn under to keep the raw edge away. So if you notice, your jeans have that hem here at the bottom, so it makes it to where that raw edge isn't exposed, um, and it keeps the fabric from fraying. Then our next word is quilting. So quilting is the process of stitching two layers of fabric together, and this is often done with a pattern. So for quilting, you'll notice that we have these red pieces, these pink pieces, the white pieces, they're all sewn together to make a pattern or an image. You'll see a lot of different quilts that they've made and cool designs at the sewing studio on our field trip. Now let's look at some of our stitches. So the whip stitch, these are hand stitches that you would use. The whip stitch is when you do diagonal stitches and you just keep going around the fabric every time. So they're short diagonal stitches and you go through the back of the fabric every time. Next, we have the overcast stitch. So this one is the whip stitch. It's often used on the raw edge of the fabric, and it can be used to finish the edges neatly and keep it from fraying. So you can see the overcast stitch here. Once again, just like the whip stitch, it goes around and you go through the back of the fabric every time, but it helps keep the fabric from fraying. Next, you have your cross or catch stitch. So this is often used to finish a hem. So let's say your pants were too long and you wanted to hem them up and make them a little bit shorter, or tack them, which means just like loosely keep it together. You would use your cross or catch stitch. So the thread catches a thread or two on the hem and then the garment. So you can see that it's going through the hem there, or the seam and the garment. And then when you pull it together, it tightens it. This also gives the hem flexibility, allows it to move. So it's not just tight when you try to move your arm or your leg. Next, we have our running stitch. So this is the simplest stitch that we have that is there. So you will use this when we're sewing just simple things. You'll use it for your felt monsters, to sew the different your eyes and the noses on. So the running stitch, you simply just go through the back of the fabric, then through the front of the fabric, through the back, and then through the front, and you just keep going up and down. So when you think about sewing, this is the stitch a lot of people think of is the running stitch. Then next you have the back stitch. So before I talked about the back stitch with sewing on a sewing machine, that it locks in your stitch. This is a hand sewing back stitch. So this is similar to the running stitch, except you go back to the previous spot every single time. So you will learn this when we start our hand sewing after spring break. But the back stitch, you go through, then you go to the next spot, and then you go back to where you just came from. And then you go to the next spot, and then back to where you just came from. Then we have a blanket stitch. I'm sure you've seen this stitch on a lot of blankets, hence the name. So this is a difficult stitch. You will learn how to do this. This is what you'll use on the edge of your felt monster. So when you make your blanket stitch, you see this little go through that loop every time, and that's what leaves. You can kind of see it. The thread. There's a line of thread here too on the outside, and so that helps it from fraying. Um, and it has a line of thread right there. Then we have our slip stitch. So this is a stitch that's almost invisible. You can't see it. So the needle passes inside the fold of the hem, and then it catches one or two threads. So when you pull it together, it ends up being almost invisible. Next, we have our vertical hem stitch. So this is also nearly invisible, but it's only invisible from the front side. So the needle catches two threads in the garment, then passes behind the fold of the hem. And so then that's what keeps you from seeing it from the front side. And then last, we have a securing stitch. So when you're sewing, it's very important that you put a knot or a securing stitch at the end of your stitch. If you don't, then the entire stitch will come out. So the knot or the securing stitch is what locks it into place. The knot can't fit through the fibers of the fabric. And so it keeps the stitch in place and it keeps it from coming undone.